Hello, I'm Joe Eames, and welcome to Pluralsight's course on Angular Best Practices. I will be your guide as we discuss many different topics in Angular, all centered around making our Angular projects more robust and maintainable. Let's start by looking at the agenda for this course. This course will start out with an introduction to the course itself. In case you haven't figured it out, that's what you're watching. I'll discuss the format for the course, some prerequisites for this course, some conventions, some of the technology we will use, and that kind of thing. Then we'll get into the meat. We'll start with a module on organizing your code in Angular. In this module, we'll talk about naming your files and folders, naming your objects, organizing with Angular modules, and coming up with an entire naming convention for your Angular project. Then we'll move into some actual coding in the module on writing controllers and services. In this module, we'll discuss minification in Angular, how to build effective and maintainable controllers and services. We'll look at some specific kinds of services, and we'll take a deep look at how services are created. Next, we'll look at directives and views. In this module, we'll talk about naming directives, some advanced features of using directives, how to avoid flashes of uninitialized content, and how to write valid HTML with Angular. Lastly, we'll talk about good design principles in your HTML, including both thinking declaratively about your Angular code so that you write less of it, and how to treat your HTML as a domain-specific language. In the next module, we'll talk all about scopes. In that module, we'll look closely at Batarang, a Chrome plugin that helps in visualizing and debugging Angular. We'll talk about how and when scopes are created, how scopes can be related to each other, and their relationship to directives and controllers. The next module will be all about how to get different components in an Angular application to communicate. We'll look at how to use Angular's event system effectively, how to share data on the scope, and how to use services to communicate as well. After that will be the module on breaking down a page into components. In Angular, we are free to build our pages as one large, monolithic component that tries to do everything. Of course, this quickly becomes a maintenance nightmare. Experience has long taught us that maintainable applications are built by composing small pieces together to make large pieces. But with Angular, there are several ways to break up a page into components. We will discuss breaking up the areas of a page into controllers and directives and look at an example of doing that. Next is the module on communicating with the server. In this module, we will take a step further from the basics of HTTP and resource services, and instead look at good communication patterns, how to effectively leverage promises to make our development easier, how to configure the HTTP service to customize the headers and data that are transmitted, and how to use transforms and interceptors to modify the transmission data before and after it is received. Lastly, we will look at the REST-Angular third-party library, which is a replacement for the resource service. And in our last module, we will talk about models. We'll start by looking at what a model is, where it lives in Angular, and some features that we might want our models to support. Then we'll look at creating models with 5 different data access technologies, starting with the basic HTTP and resource services, and then going all the way to using Breeze in our application. In order to get the most from this course, you need to have a basic working knowledge of Angular, so you should really watch the Angular Fundamentals course by myself and Jim Cooper first before watching this course. In addition, we will be using Node as our web server in the demos for this course. There is no requirement for you to run Node. You can use any web server you want if you wish to follow along, but if you will be exactly following along the demos, or you will be downloading and running the demo code, then you will need to have Node installed. Installing and running Node is beyond the scope of this course, but Pluralsight has a great course on Node that you can watch to get the fundamentals of Node. This course is on best practices with Angular. As a result, I will be showing you some best practices of how to write your code. These best practices will fall into one of 2 categories. The first is accepted best practices. These will be things that time has proven to be more effective than other options, and the industry as a whole has come to some consensus on them. That doesn't mean that there aren't those who disagree, but by and large these are best practices industry-wide. Many of the best practices that fall into this category will actually be applicable to more than just Angular, but I will be showing how to apply these best practices to your Angular code. The second category is things that have yet to be widely recognized, or no clear superior solution has been accepted industry-wide, or there may be several options, none of which is clearly superior in every situation, but each may be advantageous in certain situations. Since Angular is so new and is changing rapidly, people are still finding new best practices. Because of this, for many of the things we discuss, I will actually show you several ways to solve the problem, and discuss the pros and cons of each approach, and when you might want to use one over the other. In those cases, I will give you objective analysis of each approach. It is difficult to show best practices without getting a bit deep into the framework in some instances. Because there may be some required understanding of how something in Angular functions, we will also be taking some deep dives into several areas of Angular. If it's stuff you already know, then just relax and enjoy the ride. If you find these to be a bit too advanced, then slow down, pause the video regularly, and do your best to comprehend the concepts. They will be important when discussing when and why to use one approach over another. Lastly, at the end of many of the clips you will see a short quiz. Often these questions will be very simple to answer if you are paying attention. The goal of these quizzes is not to make you memorize facts and figures, but they're really just a simple check to see if you perhaps dozed off for a minute and missed an important point. If you feel like you really understood the clip, feel free to skip the quiz and just hit the next track button on the player. As I said, the demos in this course all run against a node server. If you wish to run the demos, you simply need to type node web-server.js from the command line from the directory that contains the web-server.js file. That will run the sample, and at that point you can just browse to localhost port 8000 to run the example. I use two different variations of the web-server.js file in this course. For the first 5 modules, there is the same one that was used in the Angular Fundamentals course. For modules 6 through 9, I modified it slightly to work better with RESTful data. This modification is minor, but if you somehow get the original version of the file copied over top the correct version, it can cause errors in certain conditions. The newer version will work fine for the older demos, but the newer demos won't all work with the older version. For those who don't have access to the sample code, I have provided 2 files on my GitHub account, the web-server.js file and the CSS file. The rest of the code should probably be stuff you can reproduce by hand by watching the demos, but those two you probably can't. You can see the URL to my GitHub repo right here. As I go through the course and show you code, you will notice that the demos are organized such that several objects are in the same physical file. So a single file may contain multiple controllers, directives, or services. I do this entirely for the benefit of showing the code without having to flip back and forth between lots of files. This works great for a video course, but not so great for a real application. In Module 2, I talk about file organization. That is where you should make your decisions on how you organize your files. Don't take my file organization methods in the demos to be an endorsement of using that method in a real project. That is simply for convenience in this course. In this course, there are a few different tools that are worth mentioning. The first is WebStorm. WebStorm is a paid product from JetBrains. JetBrains is the same company that makes IntelliJ, ReSharper, and TeamCity. I have been a long-term fan of theirs since I started using ReSharper years ago. For my front-end development, I use WebStorm as my primary code editor. I love the features it offers, such as tight integration with source control, a built-in Node and Karma runner, code issue highlighting, and automated refactorings and coding suggestions. It is also very reasonably priced. But by no means is WebStorm required for this course. You can use any editor from plain old Notepad to Sublime to Visual Studio. Nothing I do will be dependent on WebStorm. For a web browser, I use Chrome. Chrome has the Batarang plugin for visualizing and debugging Angular. We will be using that plugin extensively in this course, so you'll be missing out if you don't have Chrome and you don't have that plugin installed. But again, Chrome isn't required. I make no guarantees that any of the demo code works in any other browser, but there's no reason that it shouldn't. The demos are extremely simple, as is the CSS. Speaking of CSS, I use Twitter Bootstrap for the CSS in many of my demos. Bootstrap happens to be extremely popular, which is why I chose it, but you shouldn't consider this to be an endorsement of Bootstrap. I also use Lodash instead of underscore in a few demos. Again, you should make your own judgments on which of those 2 libraries to use. So that's it for the introduction to this course. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or hit me up on Twitter and say hi. I hope you enjoy watching this course as much as I enjoyed putting it together.